Thanks everyone for being patient and coming to the session. This session is about Microsoft 365 DSC and how we can use it to essentially automate or manage all of our M365 cloud tenants. So I guess before we start, thank you to the sponsors. You can take some time to look at those, super interesting. Yeah, so if you don't know, my name's Ryan. I'm cloud architect slash like to have letters in front of my name at Workspace. It's my own company. I've been a Microsoft trainer for the last several years. PowerShell enthusiast, been involved for probably more than, I don't know, since PowerShell 3 definitely, maybe not quite PowerShell 2. But yeah, OG DSC user, I've been using it for a long, long time. So hopefully if any questions that you have regarding DSC, I should be able to answer them. Yeah. It's a bit of a dying breed of people, the DSC folk, but yeah. I guess hands up anyone who actually is using DSC right now. Just 2 people, okay. Anyone that's used DSC before? Okay, more people. Maybe I can convert some of you back to DSC, at least for this specific topic at least. So who are you, the people who are interested in this topic? So it's anyone who's going to be managing M365, whether that means you're like an IT service provider and you're looking to manage your customers' tenants, or whether you're just internal IT and you want to manage your own environment. You'll see when we look at how I'm using the tool, it also applies to if you're some form of security or auditor, because you'll be able to essentially track the state of your environment over time and manage it. And that's separate from obviously all of the auditing tools that we have in M365 anyway. So what is DSC? So DSC is a configuration as code tool built in PowerShell. So it's designed to run originally with the WMF4, which is installed way in 2008 server. But now for most people who are going to be using it, it's going to be when they're using version 5 on whatever version of Windows they have. So I make that point really clear, because even if you're using PowerShell 7, DSC doesn't technically work in that space. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So just to say, it doesn't work cross-platform. So even though I'm on a Mac, it doesn't work on here natively. I have got some tricks that I'll show you guys at the end to make some of it work. But yeah, just out of the box, it's designed to run with Windows PowerShell. So moving on. So yeah, what DSC does, essentially it has this method by which we can do the get, set, and test. So if you think to how other infrastructure as code tools work, whether that's Terraform or Pulumi, they'll have a state manager where they write the state and they'll track things locally over time. DSC doesn't work that way. DSC has this get, set, and test, which it does. So these 3 methods are applied to all resources that you want to run. And yeah, so the get is pretty obvious. It will gather the state of the current resource that you're trying to gather. And this is really useful for things such as reverse DSC, which is another open source tool which you can use essentially to create DSC configurations from your current environment. So if you didn't know about that, that's also a really cool thing, and we're going to touch on this in this M365 tool. Or you can obviously use it as well to create documentation if you want to query the environment without actually writing all of your own PowerShell. The set obviously makes it so desired state, or DSC stands for desired state configuration. Maybe I didn't say that at the beginning. So desired state is always the goal. You define something to look a certain way, and then eventually DSC will make it so. And then the last piece, test, is as well, it's pretty self-explanatory. It will check for compliance. In most cases, it's going to use the get to gather the information. It will check against whatever desired state you've configured, and then will determine whether the set has to run or not. So you can just run it, and it will tell you, hey, this is correct configuration, or this is bad configuration. And then also it can then use it as the execution to then start the actual set itself. So what actually is a DSC configuration? So it actually consists of a couple of different pieces. So we have the nodes. So traditionally speaking, desired state configuration was used to deploy Windows servers or servers. So you would define, for example, a node like a SQL server or a web server or domain controller or whatever you wanted to define, and that would be your node. And then you would have the resources that would do some form of configuration. So the resources are the actual doing part. So whether that's something that creates a file, whether that's something that can install SQL or whatever it may be. So in our case, for the purposes of M365 DSC, these resources are going to be things such as Teams messaging policy, or it could be Office 365 group naming policy, or it could be Azure AD application. So any of these pieces can be defined as a resource. Strictly, we don't have the nodes in Office 365. However, you could use them to refer to different environments. So maybe one node is your test environment and one node is your production environment. But we'll look at that again in a second. So moving on a little bit more, just so you know what it's actually seen like. This is actually what the PowerShell code looks like for DSC. It sort of looks a bit PowerShell-y, but also not. That's because it's a special thing unto itself. So we have this configuration keyword, and this configuration defines that we're creating ourselves a DSC configuration. Then I give it a name, and that essentially is like a function. So we're creating a configuration called file, which I'll later execute. Moving down the list, we've then got the node. And that node, in this case, is just localhost. I'm just going to be configuring myself. So for the purposes of the M365 DSC, I'm probably also just going to use localhost because I'm not going to have a management server, which I'm going to be remotely configuring. I'm just going to say, you, the machine where I currently am, are going to be responsible for configuring Office 365. Moving down, then here is the definition of a resource. So we can have multiple resources. Obviously, you can just imagine how you can just keep extending this. And this is a PowerShell script. So I could, if I wanted to, have PowerShell above or below or wherever. So if I wanted to get certain information out of here, like, for example, the content of that file, maybe I want to read it from a file share, I can do a get content from a file share. If I needed to know the number of files or the configuration number of like the specific port configuration I wanted to run, I can get that from a CMDB perhaps with a REST query. So whatever PowerShell you're used to running, you can run this inside of this configuration file, and when you what you call compile the configuration, it will actually run all of that PowerShell in there and generate the configuration. So I'll give you a quick example of what this looks like. So hopefully, if my internet and everything is still connected. Your connection was lost. Not good. And I have no internet. Damn it. So just so you know, I generally am more prepared than this. And I had a Windows machine which I was going to bring today, and that decided to blue screen yesterday and not boot anymore. So I had to emergency build a VM in Azure, which is why I'm dependent on the internet. I didn't want to have to be. But anyway, so here we go. So if we jump to the prerequisites, you can see here is the section, similar configuration what I just created before. So if I just run this here, you'll see nothing actually happens, but what I've defined is this configuration file. And here I was working on some other testing before. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run my file configuration and output it into a folder in this file directory. And if I do that, you'll see that it actually creates this file. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about how DSC works all in the background because it's not super necessary for you guys to know right now. I could give you a ton of resources later on about how you can go into the depths of DSC and how it all works in the background. But just for your purposes, it creates this file, and in this file here is the definition that I've written here, but in a machine-readable way. So any of the loops or whatever I've created here, any of the PowerShell that I've written here will have essentially been executed and generates this file. So once I finish that, how do I actually apply it? Because nothing's actually happened. I can do what's called or use this start DSC configuration command, and that will effectively run or make this configuration so. So if I run this, you'll see something happened. If I go now and check this directory, if I go to my downloads directory in this M365 DSC folder, no, Mac, deny. No, go away. Don't bother me now. Right, you'll see here I got this test file, which was literally just created, and here the content is test. So very, very basic, but that is essentially what DSC is made to do. You define a configuration and it will make it so. If we jump back to the presentation, so there was a tiny little piece under the hood that was hidden there, which I need to briefly explain. So When I ran that start DSC configuration command, it actually triggers a process inside of Windows. And that piece that's managing that is what we call the LCM, or the local configuration manager. And it, as I said, it essentially orchestrates the execution of the DSC. So when I ran this start DSC configuration, I essentially instructed the LCM to take that configuration file that I passed it and then start applying it in whatever way it's configured to do that. So the LCM can operate in 3 different ways. So again, if you're thinking about in Azure or in Office 365, if you wanted to configure something, maybe you have your configuration and you just want to monitor that it looks like this, and you can put it in monitor mode. And in that way, it will just report to you that the state is either correct or not correct. And it will tell you which resources are correct or incorrect and why. Maybe for example, the parameter X is set to true when it should be set to false. We can have the apply once option, whereby, pretty self-explanatory. I will tell it to apply. It will apply the configuration once in the environment. And then after that point, it will monitor. The actual thing is called apply and monitor, but I'll just say here apply once. And then the last one is apply and autocorrect. This is, I guess, the most CI/CD full infrastructure as code option. So essentially, if anyone is messing around in your environment in the cloud, if they change property from property X from true to false, the LCM will, on a schedule, detect that, run, test, find it, then correct it and revert it back again. So yeah, so that's a really useful function that will get your environment always to avoid what we call the configuration drift. Everything will go back to its desired state. But as I said, if you're doing this, that can only run then on a Windows machine, and you can't then run it, for example, from a build machine, or you can't run it from a Mac, or if you want to run one individual resource just out of sync of a whole configuration, if you don't want to do all of this hassle here, we have another way to trigger this. And if I jump down, we have direct invocation via the invoke DSC resource. So if I jump back to my VM and just close this up, I've got essentially the exact same resource here that was defined above. So here you can see I've defined the file resource, and here are all the parameters. And if I've looked on here, I'm just invoking that file resource again. And I'm saying, hey, with these properties, this destination, this type, etc. And I'm calling specifically the get method. So when I spoke about it before, I said that we have the 3 methods, the get, the set, and the test. So I'm just going to call get. So if I run this now, you'll see that I've got the status of this resource. So you can see that it is present. We can see its size. We can see its modification date, etc. And just for example, if I was to delete it, you can see here now the status is absent. So I can always get the most current status, and if I was to swap this out for test, just to show you, it would also then just return false instead of true, because we are telling the configuration that it should in fact be present. And I've lost my internet again, or something's gone wrong. Why? Why? Of course, nothing can go right. Okay. Maybe we'll let that run in the background. So you can just pretend that it said test false. So so then moving on. So we're talking about M365 DSC. So I just wanted to cover there just the basics for those of you who haven't seen it, or those of you who haven't seen it for a long time. That is essentially what DSC does. So it has this configuration manager on Windows. We can invoke the resources directly. We have this configuration where you define what I want it to look like, and then the DSC engine, whichever way around you're doing it, whether you're invoking it directly or via the LCM, will make it so. So what specifically is Microsoft 365 DSC? So Microsoft 365 DSC is a module written by the community and Microsoft that contains all the resources pertaining to M365 so all of the services that we have there. I have the web page loaded here, but of course, the fact that it's loaded means that it's probably not actually going to work now, because I have no internet. Right, so if you look here, I've got 2 phones here with 2 hotspots, and neither of them are working. So let's just we move. So if we son of a gun. I tried and it wasn't working. Let me see. Come. Haha. Right. So if we look here, we have all of these different resource types. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but just you can see here we support various different resources, whether that's Azure AD, Intune, SharePoint, Teams, etc. And this is what makes M365 DSC unique compared to other tools. So me, avid Terraform user, Terraform has a resource provider for Azure AD, but it doesn't have a provider for Exchange, for example, or Intune. So if I want to create my Intune configurations for my Windows devices, I can't do that via my Terraform. I have to do it another way. I could call the graph directly via PowerShell, but this gives me a very structured way to do that. So let's hope now that my VM is back online. Right, okay. See if that works. Right, great. So, okay, so now let's start looking at the M365 DSC. So we'll jump in here. And this was all nicely done in VS Code before, but obviously having to jump on a VM now meant that all went away. So essentially the very easy way to install, if you don't know how to install modules in PowerShell, you can essentially run this, this command here, install -module, and this will install it. The developer of this resource decided not to add the other resources as required modules. So the way that you actually get all of the other dependencies is by running this update M365 DSC dependencies. And if I run this as a validation, you'll see that it just wants to check, do I have the modules installed, and it will just return the state. But if I change this from validate to force, it would then install all of the modules for me. Once you've done that, you're going to have to log on to the actual Office 365 service. And for those of you who don't know, essentially that all happens via enterprise applications, which are installed into your tenant. In order for those to work, you need to grant them access. So for my case, I've already done this, but I'll just show you if I try to update the graph scopes, essentially what this is going to try and do is it's going to update for all of the potential scopes that are available for M365 DSC. It's going to make sure that I can write to those particular scopes. So here it's going to try and log me in. And of course, it's not got the password. You guys didn't see this password. It's just my demo tenant. Right. So now the scope's been granted. If you haven't done that before, you'll see a screen which will ask you for global admin to approve this access, and that needs to be done just one time in order for the enterprise application to be installed in your tenant and be granted access to perform these particular tasks. This here is just a one-time task, right? So moving on. So we're ready now. We want to start creating resources. So now let's look here. Here is the configuration I created here. So if you look here, it's essentially exactly the same as what I did before. I've got here my example configuration. I've got my, I'm going to pass in a credential because I need to log in now to Office 365, whereas locally when I was creating a file, obviously I can do that with my own credentials. Here, so I'm just importing the DSC resource, and here I'm calling this Azure AD Security Defaults resource. And if you guys know anything about Azure AD, or Entra ID as it's now called, there is a setting in there that allows you to control the security defaults, and I've just set them to false. So if I was to run that, essentially it would disable the security defaults on my machine. I've already showed you how DSC works. I don't need to show you that again, but that is essentially the most basic way to use M365 DSC. What is far more interesting is the fact that when I got distracted here, is that we can automate the configuration changes. Fine, I've just showed you that. We can monitor config drift. Okay, I've showed you how we can essentially do that with the LCM. But we can export a tenant configuration. So this is where we start to get really interesting use cases here for this tool. So I talked a bit about how we have reverse DSC, and this is essentially the same concept. So what M365 DSC has is a UI, like a small little web page that we can load here, and I can come in here and I can choose any resources that I want to export. And I can go for the default set, which contains a lot of information, or I can pick any of these defaults, or I can just say none. And I can come in here, for example, and say, I want to make sure that I export all of the role definitions that are in my tenant, for example. And if I now come up here and click generate, this will generate just a little sample here that I can then copy paste into my terminal and then run, and this will export the configuration to my machine. So being that it takes a long time to run, what I'll do is scrap some of this stuff out here, and then I'll show you one that I made earlier. But if I was to just run this now, it's going to essentially try and write this whole configuration now into this light folder. So while that's running, I shall show you the one that I made earlier. So if I open this up and go to my EXO Lite, I can look at my tenant configuration for my Exchange Online config. So if I scroll down here, you can actually see it exported everything that is in my Exchange environment. So it exported my accepted domain. It exported my anti-phishing policy. And it took every single piece, and I obviously didn't filter this at all. I just told it just to export everything. But essentially what I've done now is I've got a backup of my entire Exchange environment. And if I wanted to, then I can just, the same as way as I just did before, this configuration has got a name, M365 tenant config. I could now just call this M365 tenant config here with the configuration data, and I would have my tenant back the way it was before. And of course, if I swapped out the credentials and changed the config data, so if I just briefly show you the config data here, essentially there's nothing of use in here, so just not that I'm hiding anything from you guys. So if you just change the credentials, then this would apply all of this configuration then to another tenant. So as I said, if you're looking at going from test to production, you can just export your test environment, import it into production. If you're a service provider and you've got a customer 0 that you've got like your perfect example of how an environment should look like, export that configuration, push it to all of your other customers just in one go. All of them now look exactly the same. So this is a really, really great tool for that. But then maybe you want to audit your environments. So you can take one configuration and compare it to another configuration. And if I there's a command for that in this suite called compare configuration. And essentially, I'm just not trusting that any of my commands work right now with internet access. So I'm just going to work off my backups. So I created one earlier, and essentially here is the Delta report of my 2 environments that I created. And if you look here, it says there are 11 resources missing in the destination, and there are 6 resources that are configured differently. So if I look at the 6 resources that are configured differently, I can look through and I can say, oh, okay, so the Teams meeting global policy has these things different. Okay, so a cloud recording is set to false, but not to true, etc. So imagine again, you go into a customer's environment and you want to go and give them an audit. You can within, let's say, a matter of half an hour, you've extracted their whole environment. You've given them some report, and this report can be extracted in HTML, Excel. It can come in various different formats. Hand it to your customer and say, look, here is your environment. These are the things that are not good. I'll charge you $50,000 to make this good, or whatever you want to do. So yeah, so that's another cool feature. Then
Sorry for the question. Can you export the particular temp configuration to something like JSON?
Yeah. So I was just going to show you here. So this is the actual command to generate that report. So I can generate a report directly from the environment. I can do Excel, HTML, JSON, or Markdown.
That's the comparison, or
This is the report. So before I was showing the comparison, I took 2 separate configs and then chucked them together. And this is essentially the same command, except I'm pulling a direct from the environment. So I'm saying this configuration that I've already pulled out, and I've pulled it now as a PowerShell file, that's not readable for the user. Rather than comparing the 2, I now just want to give that configuration to somebody as a document that they can read themselves. So essentially the same command exists as a compare, and I just wanted to show you that here when you do the report, you can choose the format, and it's exactly the same. So yeah, so I chose HTML. That's why obviously I've got a web page. Right. So yeah. So then thinking that's really cool. So if I was to do this in my production environment, what I would also consider doing is in the best case scenario, nobody has access to this, and I'm only doing this via some repository. People make the code changes in my Git repository, and then it's all done. However, that's not the real world that we live in. everyone has access to our environments and they can make changes whenever they want, unfortunately. So we need to be able to track those changes. And yes, of course, we can do auditing in the environment, but it would be much better if I could do this in an automated way so it's back into my configuration repository. So what I did was I just made a very basic example, hopefully. May have to jump back into GitHub. So I have this demo tenant CI, and essentially what I did was I created this a GitHub action, and what this GitHub action does is it has to run on a Windows box. It will go and export the configuration. So I've given it the credentials in the form of secrets in the repository, and it goes and it does an export configuration, and I've just told it to export the Intune settings catalog. And I picked this one specifically because I don't know if you guys have ever tried to do management of Intune security settings, but it's an absolute nightmare. There's no sort of built-in tools to do it. And if you try and read it from the graph, you get a massive JSON document, which is very difficult to read and understand. You get a ton of GUIDs back, etc. So yeah, so here I'm just doing that, and essentially I'm just committing it back into the repository. So what essentially happens here is that every time this runs, I get this Intune folder, and inside this Intune folder, I get my configuration, which tells me, this is my Intune policy for Windows. It's called My Settings. And inside there, we have this device vendor config authentication, allow Azure AD password reset value 1. So again, this is still quite difficult to read, but trust me, it's a million times easier to read than the JSON that you get back from the Graph API. And my eyes are trained to read it. So I've got used to reading it. But just to show, if I was now to go actually to that tenant and make a change. Oh wait, actually, I don't trust that it's going to work. So I'll just show you the commit. So if I look at my commit history for this repository, I should have just done history on that file. Here, if I look here, I can come in here and I can see, okay, so 6 hours ago, this change was made and somebody added a new setting. So somebody changed this setting from, well, it's because it's very large here, it's very difficult to read. Unified. Yeah, so it was changed from allow password reset was removed, and then I added this require device encryption option. So yeah, okay, maybe it's not the super simplest way. It's not like a beginner person could just come in here and just read it. I couldn't like ask my mother to read it, but if you are trained to read this, or if at least if you come in here and look and you see that there are changes, you are able to capture those changes, know when they were made, and you can easily revert them. We can just revert the commit, push the infrastructure back in, or push the code back in rather, sorry, and then the infrastructure will go back to looking like it was before. So that's one example of how you can do this. And then I just want to show one last cool feature from M365 DSC, and that's a feature called blueprints. So we have this thing where we can assert a blueprint. So again, think back to maybe you're doing an assessment of an existing customer, and you don't want to necessarily give them you don't want to extract the whole configuration like you just saw before. Maybe you just want to do a security review and say, hey, is your tenant SIS compliant? Is it SIS level 1? So you could spend a lot of time, I haven't done it, but you could spend a lot of time writing all the configuration so that it matches the SIS1 policy. And what the blueprint function allows you to do is define these special comments on the end. So essentially, just to explain, sorry, this is a normal DSC configuration like any other, and I've just given it the name M365 just so that's sort of the standard that has been laid out, and it essentially just separates out from all of your other configurations. And if you use this comment syntax here on the end, you essentially can define how the report is going to report errors out if they don't match your configuration. So here you can see L1 is essentially like a low risk problem, and L2 is a high risk problem. And then I've defined here some text on the end that says, okay, we don't want that users have recording because of XYZ reason. So again, you could take this straight out of the SIS documentation or whatever you follow, and then drop it into here. And then if I run my magic command, which is assert DSC blueprint, I can say, take the blueprint file that I've got here on disk, I just showed you, and output the report to this HTML file. And because it's essentially running the configuration, or sorry, not this one, it's essentially running this configuration with a get, I don't need to have global admin permissions. I could just have global reader, should be probably enough to get all of the access. So I don't need to have this super crazy permission in order to do this. I pass that credential in. And again, I'm not going to run it because I don't trust that everything's going to be working. But if I double click the blueprint, here I can check this blueprint and you can see here, okay, cloud recording is not enabled or is enabled when it shouldn't be because of that reason. And again, I could just send that to my customer. Nice report, nice colored boxes. That's what management people like. Yellow is not so good. Red is really bad. And then again, we've included an article here to the Microsoft documentation, and I can just easily send this to the customer and say, these are the things that we need to address. Let's create a project to make this happen. So yeah, that's, I guess, most, if not all, the features that we have in M365 DSC. I've done a lot of stuff around this in my own tenant, but yeah, I think we are probably at the end there. We're at 33, so yeah, we've got time for questions. We've got some useful information. So we have the DSC community call, which generally happens every month. If you go to that URL there, you'll find the website, and it includes all of the other DSC modules, which are sort of supported by the DSC community. And then also, here's the link for the M365 docs. The last maybe terrible, what do you call it, plug I'll do is about 10 years ago, I had a blog that I have since long never updated, but there's 28 blog posts in here on how to go from DSC nothing to DSC professional, essentially. So if you are looking to onboard yourself into DSC, I spent a lot of time writing all these blog posts, and they are still valid today. So if you find other materials, But yeah, if you want to, here's the URL. You can get that. Yeah, and that is probably it. So if you have any questions, please shoot them to me now. So that's not going to be a configuration because it's not something we can set. But there's no doubt that you can add something in to do that. There's no doubt, yeah. But yeah, it's not a default feature. If I jump back to the 365 DSC here, we can do a search, and I'm almost sure that the secure score is not going to show up here. Yeah, so unfortunately it's not going to show up in here, but yeah, it's not in there. But again, you could easily obviously add that in, but it's because the tool is designed to track configurations that we can manipulate, and the secure score itself is more an analogy to this tool itself. It's analyzing the configuration and then saying, hey, this is good or bad. But what you obviously could do is all the recommendations that do appear in the secure score, you can take those, implement them here in DSC, and then have them be automatically remediated by DSC. So then the score will go up, but obviously they're being managed from this tool. Cool. Any other questions? Sure. Let's start with, why are you using ISC? So the reason I'm using ISC is because I couldn't install the VS Code with all my extensions in the time allocated. My machine broke last night. Otherwise, I would, of course, be using VS Code.
Microsoft M365 DSC is working from PowerShell 7 also, right?
So you can, so yes, maybe I sort of very briefly skipped over that. So we have, where did I have it? Let me just jump back to the thing. So if you're going to do this, if you create the configuration and you want to apply it, that configuration that gets created can only work in Windows 5. So you have to use the start DSC configuration because it relies on that LCM, which is only a part of Windows. However, you can directly invoke the resources via Windows, via PowerShell 7. So if you want to use this command, that will work perfectly fine. And maybe, if we're lucky.
No, I meant specifically for the, what was the name of the module? M365 DSC module.
Yep. No. So you can install that on PowerShell in PowerShell 7.
Configuration file that has to be executed.
Exactly. So So just to jump back a little bit. So this is a core piece of DSC. So the resources that the M365 DSC module has, let's say, the logic to actually change the environment. So it has functions in there, for example, AD group. And in there, you can pass it the properties and it will create an AD group. However, to know that has to be the case, we either can invoke it manually with this invoke DSC resource, which I can do on my Mac on PowerShell 7, so that does work. However, if I want to go through that process of creating the configuration and then generating that file and then saying start DSC configuration, that has to run on a Windows machine, and that only runs in Windows 5.1.
Yeah, but you will invoke only a particular resource, not the whole configuration.
If you don't want to invoke the whole configuration, you can do that on in PowerShell 7, and you can do it on Linux, Windows, Mac, whatever you want.
Yeah, I'm asking that in regard, we had a scenario where we wanted to use this tool and
Yep.
some other tools, but we have the requirement of supporting everything cross-platform,
Yep.
including major platforms.
Yep.
It turns out that neither DSC or anything built on top of DSC
Yep.
fits that scenario, and the silly thing is Ansible also doesn't fit that scenario.
Yep.
So there is no tool to pick
Yeah.
that scenario.
So as I say, you can. So I would say it's not going to be a hard and fast rule. I can't promise you this is always going to be the case, but I would assume that the majority of those DSC resources, which are built, even the ones that were built back in 5.1, as long as they're calling some cloud-based service and obviously not running something locally on the machine, then you can take those and run those in PowerShell 7, definitely, and probably almost certainly run them cross-compatible. There is something. If you like, I mean, you didn't actually say about the Windows thing, so we'll ignore that. But yeah, any ones that are calling cloud-based services like this M365 DSC or any others that are calling cloud services should work in PowerShell 7 cross-platform Linux and Mac. And just to say, I have got many environments where I do just do the direct invoke DSC resource. So you don't have to use that DSC configuration method. I only show that because that's sort of the history, and that is a definite way you can do it. And you have a build, like a management server, which deploys all of your configuration and monitors it, and that's the only way in which you're going to get the auto correction. It's going to sit there and it's going to monitor, it's going to run on a schedule, and it's going to do that because that's what that LCM piece does. But if you just want to say, yeah, I'm going to run this myself, I've got my own scheduling system or I've got my own build box, and you just want to run invoke DSC resource, that can work across platform. Yep. Any other questions? Okay, sorry, yeah, keep going.
I'm asking all that because I'm not sure if you can comment, but there's some development in the DSC area from Microsoft. I've seen some posts last month about the next DSC.
I was just about to show it to you. So if you have any other questions, keep that one, because I'll show it to you. It's right here. But if you have any other questions first, I'll answer those, and then I'll show you the DSC V3. Okay, cool. So DSC V3. So there is, maybe if I can load it here. So I believe this is the project you're talking about, right? DSC PowerShell.
No, I'm talking about, they said that DSC will be the cutoff from PowerShell. It will be a product of itself.
That is exactly this. So this is not built on PowerShell, even though it sort of is strict. It says up there PowerShell, but it's not. So this is it's a cross-platform. So it runs across all the platforms, and it's essentially an executable onto itself. And the resources are written, can be written in Bash, Python, Go, or whatever. So just to prove that to you, I am on my Macintosh here. And if I was to just run, for example, DSC help, obviously this has been, everything's been reset. So 1 second. Right, okay, so I think I should have it now. Right, yeah, so now everything is broken. Right, so you can see this is what the executable looks like. This is in alpha, so it's way from being ready to use. But we have some ways in which we can already use this now. So if I show you this configuration, everything's got screwed up on my machine. Right, so this here would be an example of a new V3 DSC configuration. So you can write them in JSON or you can write them in YAML. And this, for example, is a completely native DSC resource. So if I, just to show you, did a DSC resource list. Is this big enough, or is it okay? Come. Very slow. Yeah, so here you can see, so these are all of the resources that have been discovered on my machine. So obviously all of the M365 ones. We've got OS info, process, which I can kick off or close on my machine. And then we have these PowerShell ones, which are sort of the traditional ones. So you can see here, this is based on the DSC group, PowerShell group. So if I call this one, this is a native resource, and if I call this one, this is a one that's linking from PowerShell. So now the way you actually execute this is I need to pass the configuration as a text input to the actual DSC command. So if I just essentially cat that file, which is obviously not in that directory. Second. I think it's there. Yeah. So now, essentially, it's now taken in that configuration now, and now it's going to start evaluating. So it's going to try and get the status of my Mac, and then it's going to log into M365, grab my AD group naming policy, and return the status. So here you can see here the state of my OS info is family Mac OS, and I said that it had to be Mac OS. So if I was to test this, it would return true. And here is the DSC group configuration, and here you can see it's absent, so I actually don't have a group naming policy right now. So that is the new V3, and yeah, I could just to show you that it is in the works. It does sort of half work a little bit. We are working on it, so if you do have questions about it, if you do have things you want to be in there, go to the repository, raise issues or raise features that you want to have in here. The team are actively working on developing this right now. And yeah, hopefully this will be, sort of the golden solution, because we've been waiting a long time for DSC to be upgraded from its current state, and it's been through various different iterations, and this is the current one. So hopefully that's going to actually make it to production. But yeah, that's everything. If there's any questions, I can take some more questions. Otherwise, I think we're done. Thank you very much for listening.